February 1941. London. The city burned in patches. Not the apocalyptic inferno of the Blitz's peak months, but the stubborn, persistent burning of a nation that refused to die. Smoke twisted through the Thames fog like the ghosts of dead empires. Captain Nathaniel Aldridge stood on the steps of the War Office in Whitehall, watching clerks hurry past with files pressed against their chests like shields. The building's facade bore fresh scars from a bomb that had landed 3 streets over the night before. 34 years old, West Point graduate, Argonne Forest survivor. Nate had seen war's face before, had watched it chew through the 77th Division in the mud of France 23 years earlier. He thought he understood sacrifice. He thought he understood desperation. He was wrong. Inside, the corridor smelled of cigarette smoke and wet wool. An officer led him downstairs, worn smooth by centuries of military boots. The deeper they went, the older the building became, until they reached a conference room that might have hosted Wellington's staff planning Waterloo. A single electric bulb hung from the ceiling. Maps covered every wall. North Africa, Greece, Crete. 5 men sat around a scarred oak table. British officers, their uniforms carrying the weight of an empire fighting for its life. At the head sat Colonel Henry Patterson, his moustache grey as gunsmoke, his eyes carrying the particular weariness of men who send other men to die. "Captain Aldridge?" Patterson's voice had the texture of gravel. "Your credentials say you're an engineer." "Before the uniform, sir. MIT Metallurgy." "Good. You'll understand what we're about to show you then, and you'll understand why it's madness." Patterson slid a wooden case across the table. "Open it." Nate lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in felt, lay a bayonet. Except it wasn't a bayonet, not in any sense that made military sense. It was a steel rod, 8 inches of metal with a muzzle ring on one end and a point on the other. No edge, no blade, no crossguard, just a spike. "This," Patterson said, "is the No. 4 Mark I bayonet. As of last November, it's standard issue for every rifle in His Majesty's Armed Forces." Nate picked it up. The weight surprised him. Light, maybe half a pound. He tested the point against his thumb. Sharp enough, but the sides were smooth, rounded, useless. He looked up. "Sir, this is a tent stake." Patterson's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile. "The men call it the pig sticker. They mean it as an insult. I'd call it worse." Nate set the thing back in its case. "You're replacing the pattern 1907. The sword bayonet. We have no choice. Sir, respectfully, every army on earth issues knife bayonets. Germany, Russia, even Japan. A soldier needs... Let me show you something, Captain." Patterson stood and walked to a filing cabinet. He pulled out a folder thick as a Bible and dropped it on the table. The impact scattered dust. Inside were production reports, manufacturing surveys, labor statistics. Nate scanned the first page, then the second. Then he stopped reading and started understanding. Britain was drowning, not in water, in numbers, in the mathematics of total war. Patterson's finger stabbed at a chart. "We need 3.5 million bayonets. We can produce perhaps 800,000 knife bayonets per year. Perhaps. The Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield is running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Every skilled toolmaker we have is already committed. Every forge is at maximum output." "Expand capacity," Nate said. "Bring in contractors." "We tried." Patterson flipped to another page. "The pattern 1907 requires 17 inches of forged steel. It needs heat treatment, grinding, edge work, handle fitting. Each bayonet demands 6 hours of skilled labor. Captain, we don't have 6 million hours. We don't have the workers who know how to do the work. Nate stared at the numbers. The math was brutal, undeniable. So you're issuing spikes. We're issuing what can be made. Patterson pulled out another document. Singer Manufacturing Company. They make sewing machines in Clydebank. Last month they started making these. He tapped the spike bayonet. Prince Smith and Stell's, woolen machinery, they're making bayonets now. Howard and Bullough, cotton spinning equipment, also bayonets. Sewing machine factories, Nate said slowly, are making weapons. Sewing machine factories can stamp metal and weld joints. That's all this requires. Patterson closed the folder. We're not trying to make the best bayonet, Captain. We're trying to make 3 million of them before the Wehrmacht reaches London. The room settled into silence. Outside, somewhere in the city, an air raid siren began its rising wail. No one moved. Londoners had learned to distinguish between warning and immediacy. Patterson lit a cigarette. Your government sent you to evaluate Lend-Lease equipment requests. I'm showing you this because you need to understand what you're seeing. We're not incompetent. We're not stupid. We're desperate. There's a difference. Nate looked at the spike again. In his mind, he saw the M1905 bayonet American doughboys carried. 16 inches of blade, strong enough to pry open crates, cut wire, dig fighting positions, a tool as much as a weapon. This British spike couldn't do any of that. It was barely more than a sharpened rod. The men will hate it, he said. The men already hate it. Patterson exhaled smoke. But they'll carry it anyway, because it's what we have. The next morning, Nate met Sergeant Reginald Blackwood at Victoria Station. Rex was 47, built like a brick shithouse, with a face that looked like it had stopped shrapnel with its forehead and won. His handshake could crush walnuts. His eyes were the pale blue of winter ice. Captain Aldridge. Rex's accent carried the working-class weight of East London. I'm told you're here to watch us make fools of ourselves with inadequate equipment. I'm here to observe. Right. Well, first observation, the tea here tastes like boiled socks, but it's hot and it's free. Rex handed him a tin cup. Second observation, you're about to see how we train men to kill with medieval weapons. They took a train north. Scotland. The landscape turned from bombed-out urban sprawl to rolling green hills that had never seen a German bomber. The training camp sat in a valley between two ridges, a collection of Nissen huts and mud that could have been transplanted from the Somme in 1916. Recruits drilled in the rain. 200 men, most of them barely 20 years old, thrusting steel into straw-filled dummies suspended from wooden frames. The instructor was a colour sergeant whose voice could strip paint. "Thrust! Withdraw! Thrust! Withdraw!" The men stabbed. Again! Their breathing came harsh and ragged. Sweat mixed with rain on their faces. Nate watched from the edge of the parade ground. Rex stood beside him, arms crossed. Pattern 1907 gave a man 5 feet 2 inches of reach, Rex said. With the rifle, I mean. Long enough to outreach a Frenchman or a German with their shorter weapons. Staff officers were very particular about that. And now? Now they get 8 inches of spike and the instruction to make it count. A recruit stumbled. The dummy swung back and knocked him flat. The others kept stabbing. No one laughed. No one helped. They just kept driving steel into straw. In the Great War, Rex continued, his voice dropping to a tone meant only for Nate, bayonet wounds accounted for less than 1% of casualties. Sometimes they didn't even bother to count them separately, put them down as miscellaneous with equipment accidents and falls. Then why drill it at all? Rex turned and looked at him, really looked at him, the way one veteran measures another. You were at Argonne. Yes. Ever fix bayonets? Twice. Use it? Nate remembered. The trench, the German soldier coming around the corner, the moment of mutual recognition and terror. The lunge, the resistance, the scream. Once, he said quietly. Then you know. Rex looked back at the drilling men. It's not about the bayonet. It's about what it does to the man carrying it. You take a clerk from Manchester, a farmer from Yorkshire, boys who've never hurt anyone in their lives, and you make them scream and stab for hours every day. You turn them into something else, something that can run at machine guns, the colour sergeant bellowed. Again, like you mean it, like you want to live. The recruits thrust harder. Their shouts echoed off the hillsides. The bayonet, Rex said, is a lie we tell ourselves. We say it's a weapon. What it really is, Captain, is a device for making civilians into killers. The physical damage it does is almost irrelevant. The psychological transformation is everything. Nate thought about that. About the engineering of human behavior, about tools designed not for function but for effect. And you think that works? He said, even with a crude spike? Rex smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. I think the Germans won't know the difference when they see it coming. Now March gave way to April. Nate accompanied Rex to factories across southern England, places that had made typewriters and bicycles and kitchen appliances now stamped out instruments of war. At the Singer plant in Clydebank, women operated the presses. The machinery hammered in rhythmic thunder. Steel blanks went in one end, bayonets came out the other. No grinding, no finishing, just stamp, weld, inspect, box. The forewoman was named Margaret, 50-something, hands calloused from decades of precision work. She showed Nate a completed Mark II spike. Not pretty, she said over the noise, but it's straight, it's strong, and we make 5,000 a day. Does it bother you? Nate asked. Making weapons? Margaret looked at him like he'd asked a stupid question. My son's in North Africa. Somewhere. They don't tell us where. If this keeps him alive, I'd make 10,000 a day. She set the bayonet back in its crate. Pretty doesn't matter, Captain. Working matters. That night, Rex took him to a pub in Glasgow. They sat in a corner booth with warm beer and cold meat pies. The wireless played dance music. People laughed. For a moment, you could almost forget there was a war on. You think we're mad? Rex said. It wasn't a question. I think you're practical. Nate pushed his beer around in circles. But I also think your men are going to try opening ration tins with these spikes and fail. They're going to try cutting wire and fail. They're going to need a knife, a tool, something with utility, and all they'll have is a pointed stick. True. So when they're in the field, cold and hungry and scared, they're going to curse your names. Also true. Rex drained his beer. But here's what you're missing, Captain. When ammunition runs out, when the rifle becomes a club, when there's nothing left but steel and will, that spike becomes the only thing between a soldier and death. Not because it's sharp, because the enemy sees it and knows what it means, which is that the man carrying it has nothing left to lose, that he's willing to close the distance, that he'll put steel in your guts if you don't run. Rex set his glass down hard. Fear, Captain. We're not manufacturing bayonets. We're manufacturing fear. Nate thought about the POW interrogations he'd read. German soldiers talking about Allied charges, the way their voices changed, the way fear crept into their words when they described seeing fixed bayonets. You're weaponizing psychology. We're using what works, Rex stood, and tomorrow you'll see if it works on you. The demonstration happened at a Rangers complex outside Edinburgh. 20 recruits, fresh from basic training, each with a Lee Enfield No. 4 rifle and a spike bayonet. Nate stood with a group of officers behind a safety line. Targets had been set up at 50 yards, man-shaped, straw-filled, wearing German helmets. An instructor addressed the recruits. You will advance at walking pace. You will not run. When you reach the targets, you will engage with the bayonet until told to stop. Understood? Yes, Sergeant. Fix. Bayonets! 20 hands moved in unison. 20 spikes clicked into place. The sound was like bones breaking. Advance! They walked, not marched. Walked. Like men approaching a gallows, the distance closed. 40 yards, 30, 20. Then something changed. One recruit started breathing harder, then another. Their pace increased, not running, but not walking anymore either. A purposeful stride, aggressive, 10 yards. Someone shouted, not words, a wordless yell. Others joined. The sound built, feeding on itself, becoming a roar. 5 yards. They crashed into the targets like a wave. Bayonets thrust, withdrew, thrust again. The straw dummies shredded. Helmets flew. One recruit kept stabbing the same target long after it had collapsed, driving the spike through straw and into the dirt beneath, again and again and again. Cease! The recruits stepped back, panting, shaking. Some of them looked at their hands like they didn't recognize them. One boy, couldn't have been more than 19, had tears streaming down his face. The officer next to Nate, a major from Sandhurst, spoke quietly. Every time I watch this, I'm reminded that civilization is very thin veneer. Nate didn't respond. He was watching the recruit who'd kept stabbing after the target fell. The boy was sitting on the ground now, head in his hands. An instructor crouched beside him, speaking too softly to hear. Rex appeared at Nate's elbow. See that? That's what the training does. Takes the inhibition away. Makes them capable of violence they never imagined. That's not training, Nate said. That's brutalization. That's survival. Rex nodded toward the shredded targets. In 6 weeks, some of those boys will be in Greece, maybe Crete, maybe North Africa. When the Germans come, when the ammunition's gone, that brutalization you're worried about becomes the only thing keeping them alive. At what cost? At the cost of their souls, probably. Rex's voice carried no emotion, just fact. But alive with damaged souls beats dead with pure ones. War doesn't care about our moral comfort, Captain. April 15th, 1941, Nate's orders came through. He was being attached to Commonwealth forces deploying to the Eastern Mediterranean. Observer status. He would accompany the 2nd New Zealand Division. His role, assess equipment performance in combat conditions and report findings to the War Department. Rex would go with him, liaison officer, which really meant keep the American from getting killed and make sure he sees what we want him to see. They met one last time in London before shipping out. The Blitz had ended, but the damage remained. Whole streets reduced to rubble, gaps in building rows like missing teeth. Rex handed him a package. Inside was a No. 4 spike bayonet. Yours, Rex said, in case you need to understand it personally. Nate tested the weight. Still too light, still too crude. He'd seen the Mark III version now, the cheapest variant. 7 pieces of sheet steel welded together and painted black to hide the terrible finish. It looked like something a prisoner might make in a workshop. I've written 17 reports, Nate said. Recommended that America include M1905 bayonets in Lend-Lease shipments. Recommended that Britain reconsider this design. And Washington says it's Britain's decision. They'll supply rifles and ammunition. Bayonets are your problem. Good, Rex lit a cigarette, because I want you to see something before you finalize your opinion. What's that? What happens when desperate men with crude weapons meet an enemy who thinks they're civilized? Rex blew smoke into the London twilight. The New Zealand boys we're joining, some of them are Maori, indigenous. They've got traditions older than this island. War traditions. When they fix bayonets and charge, Captain, you'll understand something important, which is that the weapon doesn't matter. The will does. Rex crushed his cigarette under his boot. We're shipping out in 3 days. Mediterranean theatre. The Germans are in Greece. They'll probably be in Crete by the time we arrive. Ammunition's going to be short. The Royal Navy can't guarantee resupply. So we'll be fighting with spikes and prayers. We'll be fighting with fear and steel. Rex looked at him. And you're going to document it. So when this is over, someone in America understands what we did here. Understands why we made the choices we made. Nate thought about Margaret at the Singer plant. About the recruit who'd cried after destroying a straw dummy. About Colonel Patterson's tired eyes and the math of desperation. I'll document it, he said, but I'm not promising I'll agree with it. Don't need you to agree, Captain, just need you to see. The ship was a converted freighter, packed with New Zealand troops heading east. They sailed from Liverpool on April 18th, running dark through submarine waters. Nate shared a cabin with 3 Kiwi officers. They spoke with accents that made English sound like a completely different language. On the 3rd night out, he found Rex on deck. The sergeant was staring at the black water, smoking. "Can't sleep?" Nate asked. "Never sleep well before combat. Learned that at the Somme." They stood in silence. The ship's engines thrummed beneath their feet. "You think this spike bayonet will work?" Nate said. "Really work against German machine guns and artillery? I think it worked in the last war. I think fear is consistent." Rex flicked his cigarette into the sea. "Here's something they don't put in the engineering manuals, Captain. Human beings are more afraid of being stabbed than being shot. Doesn't matter that bullets kill more people. Doesn't matter that artillery causes the most casualties. When you see a man running at you with a blade, something primitive wakes up in your brain. Primal fear. Exactly that." Rex pulled out another cigarette but didn't light it. "The Germans have beautiful bayonets, the S-84/98. Knife blade, saw back, usable as a tool, precision engineering, very civilized. And civilized weapons make men think they're fighting a civilized war. Our pig sticker makes them think they're fighting savages." Rex finally lit the cigarette. "Which do you think scares them more?" Nate had no answer for that. The Mediterranean was calm when they arrived. Greece had already fallen. German forces were consolidating. Crete was next. Everyone knew it. The 2nd New Zealand Division landed at Heraklion. The 28th Maori Battalion set up positions around the airfield. Nate watched them dig in. They worked with the efficiency of men who knew what was coming. Each man had a rifle. Each rifle had a spike bayonet fixed to it already. Rex appeared beside him. "They don't take them off. It's part of the weapons system. You fight with it attached. Even when firing? Especially then. Sights are zeroed with the bayonet on." Rex pointed to a Maori soldier cleaning his rifle. "That man's ancestors were warriors when London was a Roman trading post. They know something about fear, about fighting. Watch them, Captain. Learn something." May 20th, 1941, the Germans came from the sky. Nate would write 17 pages about what happened next. He would describe the paratroops dropping like deadly rain, the chaos of the airfield battle, the steady retreat as German reinforcements arrived. He would note ammunition consumption rates, equipment failure points, tactical decisions. But what he would remember, years later, was simpler. He would remember the sound of bayonets being fixed in the dark, the click of steel on steel, and the look in German eyes when they saw what was coming. 7 days of retreat. 7 days watching ammunition dwindle while German paratroopers pressed closer. By May 27th, 1941, the mathematics were brutal. 16,000 Allied troops, 1 evacuation point at Sfakia, and the German 141st Mountain Regiment blocking the only route south. Nate crouched behind a stone wall with Rex and a dozen New Zealand soldiers. The Mediterranean sun beat down mercilessly. His notebook stayed in his pocket. Some things you couldn't document while surviving them. "How many rounds?" Rex asked the Kiwi lieutenant. 40, maybe 50, for the whole platoon." Rex checked his rifle. The spike bayonet gleamed in the afternoon light. "Orders? Break through tonight. Reach the beach by dawn." Then Nate heard it. A voice. Deep, rhythmic, speaking words he didn't understand. 50 yards down the line, a Maori soldier had stood up. He was chanting. The haka, war dance older than empires. Others joined. The rhythm built like a heartbeat. More voices, the chant grew louder, transforming exhausted men into something primal, something dangerous. "Fix bayonets." Click, click, click. 200 men mounting steel. Rex was smiling, a wolf smile. Watch what happens when desperate men stop caring about survival and start caring about killing. They went over the wall. Walking, not running. A steady, purposeful stride toward German positions 300 yards away. Rifles at port arms, bayonets forward. The Maori roar echoed across the hills, ancient and terrible. At 200 yards, the German machine guns opened up. MG-42s tearing through the air. Men fell, but the line didn't stop, didn't slow. For every soldier who went down, 5 kept coming, 10 kept coming. At 100 yards, Nate could see German faces, young, scared. They'd been trained for enemies who took cover, who maneuvered tactically. Not this, never this walking nightmare of steel and screaming. At 50 yards, the German fire slackened. Not because the guns jammed, because the gunners were breaking. You could see the moment training gave way to panic, the realization that these men were going to reach the trenches. At 30 yards, a German officer stood to rally his troops. A Maori soldier shot him. The officer fell. Something broke in the German line. They ran. Machine gunners abandoned weapons. Riflemen threw down ammunition. The organized defense became a rout in seconds. The New Zealanders crashed into the trenches like a wave. Nate jumped down behind them. A Wehrmacht soldier came around a corner, hands raised, surrendering. A Maori corporal drove the spike bayonet into his stomach anyway. The boy made a small sound, surprised, like he couldn't believe this was real. Then his eyes went empty. The corporal moved on, already hunting the next target. All along the line, Germans who stood got steel. Germans who ran got chased. The New Zealanders weren't fighting anymore. They were hunting. Rex appeared beside Nate, his bayonet red to the hilt. "Keep moving. Don't stop. Don't think." They pushed through a mile of German positions, then another. Most Germans just ran, threw down weapons, and disappeared into darkness. By midnight, 16,000 Allied troops reached Sfakia. The Royal Navy evacuated them over 2 nights. Dawn revealed the cost: 280 German casualties, 121 killed by bayonet or clubbing. Nate sat on a stone wall, hands shaking. Rex sat beside him, smoking. "The boy in the trench," Nate said. "He surrendered." "I saw. It was murder." Rex was quiet. Then, "It was survival. That corporal chose the mission over mercy. That's what war is, terrible choices made by exhausted men." He pointed toward the empty German positions. "That boy died so 16,000 of ours could live. Debate the morality after you explain why his life was worth more." Nate had no answer. North Africa. June 1942. 13 months later. The 2nd New Zealand Division was surrounded at Minkar Kaim. Rommel's Afrika Korps had them in a pocket 40 miles southeast of Tobruk. 3 days of fighting had reduced their options to one: break out or die. Nate sat in a slit trench with Rex. The desert had burned the softness off both of them. Rex's face was leather and bone. His eyes carried the 1,000-yard stare. "How many rounds?" "None. We fired the last holding this position." Rex checked his bayonet. "We punch out heading east, straight through Jerry's lines. On foot, in daylight, with no ammunition. The alternative is dying slow from thirst." Rex looked at him. "You don't have to come?" Nate almost laughed. "I've come this far." They went over at 1,400 hours. 300 men, 0 ammunition, nothing but bayonets, and the belief that fear could overcome firepower. The desert sun was like a hammer. German positions were a half-mile away on a ridgeline, perfect fields of fire. The New Zealanders advanced in line, screaming that Maori roar. The sound echoed off rocks, became something more than noise, became physical presence. German soldiers stood in their trenches just to see what was making that sound. Then they saw 300 men with bayonets walking toward them, screaming. The first machine gun opened fire, then a dozen. Men fell, but the line kept coming. At 200 yards, a German officer fired a red flare. Retreat signal. His men didn't need telling twice. They abandoned positions, left machine guns, just ran. The New Zealanders hit the empty trenches and kept going, chasing. Because the moment you let them regroup, it was over. A German tried to surrender. Kneeling, hands up. A corporal bayoneted him in the throat. No hesitation, just survival arithmetic. Nate saw Rex go down. Bullet in the left leg. The line moved past him. Nate stopped, grabbed Rex under the arms, started dragging. "Leave me," Rex said through gritted teeth. Shut up. That's an order. I don't take orders from sergeants." A German soldier appeared, young, terrified, rifle held but not aimed. Nate shot him with his M1911. Kept dragging. They reached a depression. Nate rolled Rex into it. Through and through wound. Lot of blood, but not arterial. "You're an idiot," Rex said. "So I've been told." They waited until dark, then walked. 6 hours to Allied lines. A British patrol found them at dawn. Rex delirious from blood loss. Nate beyond exhaustion, but alive. A medic took Rex away. Nate sat in the medical tent, unable to write his report. His hands wouldn't work. "Your friend will live," a doctor said. Nate looked at his shaking hands. "We charged machine guns with bayonets. We won. I don't understand how." "Fear is a powerful weapon, Captain. Sometimes the only one that matters." El Alamein, October 23rd, 1942. The artillery barrage started at 21:40 hours. 900 guns firing simultaneously. The sound was apocalyptic. The desert lit up brighter than day. Nate was with the 2nd New Zealand Division again. Rex was back, limping, should have been evacuated but refused. Said he'd die fighting, not in a hospital bed. After 15 minutes, silence fell. Worse than the noise. "Advance!" They went forward into smoke. Couldn't see, couldn't breathe, just followed the man ahead. The German lines were deeper than expected. More mines, more wire, more bunkers. The advance bogged down. Units got separated. Nate found himself in a crater with Rex and 6 New Zealanders from different companies. "Anyone know where we are?" Rex asked. Silence. "Outstanding. Fix bayonets. We move forward until we find our lines or Jerry's." They climbed out. Ahead, 50 yards through clearing smoke, a German bunker. Machine gun position. maybe a dozen defenders. "We don't have ammunition for this, but yeah," a private said. "Then we don't use ammunition." Rex started walking toward the bunker. Fast and mean. They moved in line. 7 men against a fortified position. Should have been suicide. The Germans opened fire. Men fell. 3 left, but they reached the bunker. Rex drove his bayonet through a firing slit. Someone screamed inside. He withdrew it, thrust again. The Germans inside panicked. Their fire went wild, undisciplined, then stopped. A white cloth appeared through the slit. Surrender. Rex sat down hard. His leg wound had reopened, bleeding through his trousers. "That was stupid," Nate said, "but effective." Rex pulled out a cigarette. His hands were steady. "Write that down, Captain. Sometimes stupid and effective beats smart and dead." The battle raged 12 days. Nate documented 3 more bayonet assaults, each impossible, each successful. Private Stanley Gurney charged 3 machine gun positions, bayonet and grenades, pure aggression, killed the crews, then got killed himself. Victoria Cross, Private Percy Gratwick assaulted a strong point, with only bayonet and 2 grenades, destroyed it, died doing it. Another Victoria Cross, men doing impossible things with inadequate weapons. November 2nd, the German line broke. Rommel retreated. The Afrika Korps was finished. That night, Nate interviewed German prisoners. Same question to each. "What scared you most?" Most said artillery, tanks, air power. But one corporal from Bavaria gave a different answer. "The New Zealanders, when they fixed bayonets and charged, we knew they'd reach us. Bullets didn't stop them. They looked like men with nothing to lose, like savages. That's more frightening than any shell." Nate wrote it down. The data was undeniable now. The spike worked, not despite its crudeness. Because of it. November 4th, Rex died. Not from his leg, that was healing. A German shell hit the aid station where he was getting his dressing changed. Direct hit. 12 men killed instantly. An orderly gave Nate Rex's effects: wallet, watch, and his number 4 spike bayonet. "He wanted you to have it, said if anything happened, make sure the American got his pig sticker." Nate took it. The steel was stained. Blood and rust, impossible to tell apart. That night he sat alone, holding the bayonet, thinking about a sergeant from East London who'd understood something engineering schools never taught. Sometimes the worst tool is the best weapon. That fear matters more than function, that men will do impossible things if you give them crude steel and the will to use it. 3 days later, orders came. Captain Aldridge recalled to Washington. "Observer mission complete." He shipped out November 12th. In his footlocker, 17 notebooks. On his belt, a spike bayonet that belonged to a dead friend. The last thing he wrote before leaving Africa. "The number 4 spike bayonet is the worst bayonet design in modern military history. But I've watched it break German morale again and again. I've seen it turn defeats into victories." The British understood that war isn't won by the best equipment. It's won by the will to use what you have. Rex understood this. I finally understand it too. Recommend continuation of current design and doctrine. The pig sticker works. He closed the notebook. The ship sailed at dawn. Washington, D.C., January 1943. The War Department building was warm. Too warm after 2 years in the Mediterranean. Nate sat in a conference room with officers whose uniforms were clean and whose hands had never shaken from exhaustion. They smelled of aftershave and coffee. He smelled of travel and old smoke. On the table between them, Rex's spike bayonet, dark with old blood that no amount of cleaning could fully remove. "This is what you're recommending?" A colonel from Ordnance picked it up, turned it over. His nose wrinkled. "Captain, this is barely more than a sharpened rod." "Yes, sir." "No utility function, no secondary purpose. A soldier can't even open his rations with it." "No, sir." "Then explain to me why we should adopt British doctrine based on an inferior weapon design." Nate was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. Outside, Washington went about its business. Traffic, streetcars, people who'd never seen war arguing about war from the safety of offices. Because it works, sir. Not despite being inferior. Because it's inferior. The colonel set the bayonet down like it might contaminate him. That makes no sense. It makes perfect sense, sir. If you've seen it. Nate opened his notebook. The number 4 spike bayonet has been used in every major British and Commonwealth engagement in the Mediterranean theatre. Crete, North Africa, El Alamein. In every case, when ammunition ran low and close combat became necessary, the bayonet performed beyond expectations. You're saying a crude spike outperformed engineered knife bayonets? I'm saying it terrified the enemy more effectively, sir, which is the actual purpose of a bayonet. Nate flipped through his notes. I interviewed 87 German prisoners over the course of 18 months. When asked what frightened them most about Allied forces, 63 mentioned bayonet charges specifically. Not tanks, not artillery, fixed bayonets. A major from intelligence spoke up. And you believe this fear response is linked to the weapon's appearance? Yes, sir. The German S-84/98 is a beautiful piece of equipment. Knife blade, saw back, multi-purpose tool. It looks civilized, professional. Nate touched Rex's bayonet. This looks barbaric, primitive. When German soldiers see it coming, they don't see modern military equipment. They see men willing to kill them personally, brutally, at arm's length. That triggers something deeper than tactical fear. Primal fear, the major said. Exactly that, sir. The colonel leaned back. You're asking us to believe that British industrial desperation accidentally created a superior psychological weapon. I'm saying they recognized what mattered and designed accordingly. Nate pulled out a folder. Manufacturing data. The British produced 4.87 million number 4 bayonets between 1941 and current date. Singer Manufacturing Company alone produced 910,000 units. Long Branch in Canada, another 910,000. Savage Arms in the United States, 1.25 million. He spread production reports across the table. These weren't made in weapons factories, gentlemen. They were made in sewing machine plants, textile machinery companies, automotive parts manufacturers. Because the design is so simple that anyone with basic metalworking capability can produce them. You can't do that with a knife bayonet. You can't scale that way. So it's about logistics, the intelligence major said. It's about reality. Nate closed the folder. In total war, you don't have the luxury of perfect equipment. You have the equipment you can actually produce in the quantities you actually need. The British needed millions of bayonets. This was the only design that could deliver millions of bayonets. The room was silent. Steam heat hissed in the radiators. What are you recommending, Captain? The colonel asked. That we maintain our M1905 knife bayonet design. Our industrial capacity can support it, but that we adopt British bayonet doctrine wholesale. Fix bayonets in low ammunition situations. Train for aggression, not technique. Emphasize the psychological impact over the physical effectiveness, because the data proves that bayonet combat is 90% psychology and 10% steel. And the other 10%? Nate picked up Rex's bayonet, felt its weight, remembered the men who'd carried weapons like it into impossible situations and survived. The other 10%, sir, is the willingness to use it, and that has nothing to do with how sharp it is. The decision came down 3 weeks later. The United States would not adopt the spike bayonet. American soldiers would continue to carry the M1905 and its variants, but training doctrine would incorporate British methods, emphasis on aggressive bayonet charges, psychological conditioning, the understanding that fear could be weaponized. Nate received new orders. He was being sent back to Europe, not as an observer this time, as a liaison officer with British forces. someone who understood both American and Commonwealth approaches, someone who could translate between different military cultures. He accepted. There was nothing keeping him in Washington anyway. No family, no ties, just notebooks full of dead men's lessons and a bayonet he couldn't throw away. June 1944. Normandy. 3 weeks after D-Day. The hedgerows of France were different from the desert, closer, more confining. You couldn't see the enemy until you were on top of them, or they were on top of you, or they. Nate was attached to a British infantry brigade pushing south from the beachhead. Progress was measured in yards. Every field was a battle, every hedgerow a fortress. He was 37 years old now, still young by staff officer standards, but the years in the Mediterranean had aged him. The war had a way of doing that. His hair had started going grey at the temples. His hands still shook sometimes, especially at night. They took a German position at dawn, a farmhouse. The defenders had fled during the night, leaving equipment behind. In the basement, they found a German soldier who hadn't fled. Older man, maybe 50. Sergeant's insignia. He was sitting on the floor with his hands already up. The British lieutenant wanted to send him back to the POW cage immediately, but Nate asked for 5 minutes. The lieutenant agreed. Nate sat down across from the German, pulled out his cigarettes, offered one. The man took it with shaking hands. "Speak English?" Nate asked in German. "Some, yes." The man's accent was thick but understandable. "What unit?" 141st Mountain Regiment, originally." Nate went very still. "Where did you serve?" "Everywhere. Poland, France, Greece, Crete." The man's eyes were distant. "So many places." "Crete. May 1941. Were you at 42nd Street?" The German looked at him sharply. "You know this battle?" "I was there, other side." They sat in silence for a moment. 2 old soldiers in a basement in France, connected by a fight on an island 3 years and 1,000 miles away. "I remember," the German said quietly. "The New Zealanders, they came walking, not running, walking, and they were screaming, that sound. I still hear it sometimes." "What did you do?" "I ran. Like everyone else, we all ran." He took a drag on the cigarette. His hands had stopped shaking. "They had those bayonets, those terrible spikes, like something from the Middle Ages. We thought we were fighting a modern army, but when we saw those, we knew we were fighting savages." "They weren't savages." "No, but they made us believe they were. That is the same thing. In war." The German looked at him. "You understand this, I think. You have the look. You have seen what men become." Nate thought about Rex, about the Maori corporal who'd bayoneted a surrendering boy, about all the impossible things he'd documented. "The British designed those bayonets to be crude," he said. "Simple enough that sewing machine factories could make them. They didn't have a choice. And accidentally made something more frightening than a proper knife. Maybe not accidentally." The German considered this. "Your army. You have better bayonets, yes? I have seen them. M1905. Good steel. Good design." "We do. But you are here, learning from the British, learning their methods." "Yes. Because you understand now, the weapon doesn't matter. The fear matters." The German crushed out his cigarette. "We thought we were the terror, the Wehrmacht, the unstoppable machine, but you made us afraid, with crude spikes and screaming men. You made us more afraid than we made you." The lieutenant came down the stairs. "Time's up, Captain." Nate stood. The German stood with him. "I have a question," the German said. "That day, at Crete, if we had not run, if we had stood and fought, would you have won?" Nate remembered the mathematics. 200 men with mostly empty rifles against a fortified regiment. By any rational calculation, they should have been slaughtered. No, he said honestly, you would have killed most of us. But we ran. You ran. Because we were more afraid of your weapons than our officers. More afraid of being stabbed than being shot. The Germans smiled. It was a terrible smile. That is the genius of it. That is what we never understood. You didn't need better weapons. You needed us to believe your weapons were worse, more brutal, more savage. And we believed it. They took him away. Nate watched him go. Another old soldier who'd learned the same lessons from the other side of the bayonet. May 8th, 1945. VE Day. The war in Europe ended. Nate was in London when the announcement came. The city erupted. People dancing in the streets, strangers kissing, church bells ringing for the first time in 6 years. He stood apart from it all, on the steps of the War Office where this had started 4 years earlier. Colonel Patterson was gone, dead in the Blitz of 1944. But the building remained. Nate held Rex's bayonet. He'd carried it through France, through Belgium, into Germany itself. Never used it, never needed to, but couldn't leave it behind either. Someone had once asked him why he kept it, a crude, blood-stained piece of steel with no practical value. He'd said, because it saved my life. Not by cutting anything, by teaching me what actually matters in war. Now, watching London celebrate, he understood something else. The spike bayonet had been designed out of desperation, manufactured by companies that made sewing machines and car parts, hated by soldiers who wanted real knives. But it had armed the force that fought from Dunkirk to Berlin, had terrified German soldiers from Crete to Normandy, had worked because fear doesn't require precision engineering. Britain had turned industrial weakness into psychological strength, had weaponized their own limitations, had understood something that all the brilliant engineers and tacticians had missed. Sometimes the worst tool is exactly what you need. West Point, September 1967. Professor Nathaniel Aldridge stood at the front of a lecture hall, 60 years old, retired from active service 12 years earlier, though the war had never really left him. Now teaching military history to cadets who'd been born after the war ended. On the desk in front of him, a number 4 spike bayonet, Rex's bayonet, still dark with stains that would never fully wash out. By every objective measure, he told the class, this is the worst bayonet design in modern military history. It cannot cut, it cannot saw, it cannot pry. It has no utility function beyond stabbing. The soldiers who carried it called it the pig sticker, and they meant it as an insult. He picked it up, let them see it. And yet this weapon was used in every major British and Commonwealth victory in the European and North African theatres. It was used at Crete, where 200 men broke a German regiment, at Minkar Qaim, where a surrounded division fought its way to freedom, at El Alamein, where the Afrika Korps was finally broken. A cadet raised his hand. Sir, why did it work if it was so inadequate? Nate looked at the young man, 18 years old, clean uniform, soft hands, same age Rex had been at the Somme, same age as the German boy who'd been bayoneted in Crete. Because the enemy didn't analyze engineering specifications when they saw it coming. They saw men walking toward them with crude weapons and nothing to lose. They saw primitiveness, savagery, desperation. And that triggered something deeper than tactical fear. Primal fear, another cadet said. Exactly. The Germans had superior bayonets, better steel, better design, better everything. But when German soldiers saw this crude spike coming toward them, they ran. Not always, not everyone, but enough. enough to turn defeats into victories. He set the bayonet down gently. The British didn't have the industrial capacity to make perfect weapons, so they made weapons that were good enough to terrify. They turned their weakness into strength. They understood that war isn't won by the best equipment, it's won by the will to use what you have. The class was silent. A friend of mine carried this bayonet, Nate continued. His name was Reginald Blackwood. He was a sergeant in the British Army. He survived the Somme, Crete, and North Africa. He died at El Alamein. Before he died, he told me something I didn't understand at the time. Nate looked out the window. The Hudson River sparkled in the afternoon sun. He said, "The pig sticker works because it's crude, not despite it." He was right. The crudeness was the point. It made the enemy see us as savages instead of soldiers, and savages are more frightening than soldiers. Another hand. "Sir, are you saying we should use inferior weapons?" "I'm saying that in war there's no such thing as inferior if it accomplishes the mission. Superior is what works, and what works isn't always what's best. It's what's available, producible, and psychologically effective." Nate touched the bayonet one last time. The British made 4.87 million of these, armed an empire with them. And those crude steel spikes helped defeat the best-equipped army in history, not through cutting, through fear. Class ended. The cadets filed out. Nate stayed behind, as he always did, holding a piece of steel that represented everything he'd learned about war. That perfection is the enemy of good enough. That fear is stronger than firepower, that sometimes desperate men with crude tools accomplish what well-equipped armies cannot. He thought about Rex, about the Maori warriors at Crete, about the German sergeant in the Normandy basement who understood the trick too late. All of them had learned the same lesson, just from different positions on the blade. The bayonet went to the Smithsonian in 1972. Nate donated it along with his notebooks. They put it in a display case with a simple plaque. Number 4, Spike Bayonet. British Army, 1941 to 1960, 4.87 million produced. Called the pig sticker by soldiers who hated it and Germans who feared it. Proof that war is won by will, not perfection. Nate died in 1984, 77 years old. Lung cancer, the doctors said. Too many cigarettes in too many foxholes. The obituary in the Times mentioned his service, his teaching career, his contributions to military doctrine. It didn't mention that he'd learned everything important from a dead sergeant and a crude piece of steel. But the men who'd been there knew. The ones who'd walked toward machine guns with nothing but spikes and screaming. The ones who'd understood that sometimes the worst weapon is the only weapon you need. They knew. And they carried that knowledge, like Nate had carried Rex's bayonet, for the rest of their lives. Not because it was perfect, because it worked. And in war, that's all that ever mattered.